Coronavirus pandemic continues to put people out of work, the more help millions are going to need to make ends meet and to pay the bills. But the Wall Street Journal notes a number of banks and firms are, quote, starting to toughen their approval standards for new loans to consumers and small businesses. That means many people could find it hard to get credit just when they most need it. Joining me now to talk more about this is Jim Nussle. He's the CEO of the Credit Union National Association. He's also the former director of the Office of Management and Budget under President George W. Bush. He's a former Iowa congressman. Jim, let's just talk about this for a second. This is a harder time than 2008, 2009 was with respect to getting loans, because there are a whole lot of people who work in the gig economy, in a part-time economy as freelancers. And the same thing happened. Loan standards got higher. So when people most need money, they might be facing an environment in which they can least get it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because what we've done is we've done a survey of our credit unions across the country. We've got a little over 5,000 credit unions that are working as cooperative financial institutions. You know, they have checking accounts, the savings accounts, auto loans, home mortgages, and they do these kinds of small dollar loans as well. And 93% of our credit unions have already made a change and an adjustment and are making changes and modifications to their loan products and to their already established loans with credit union members. We got 100 million credit union members across the country, and they're already working out, making modifications. And we have a number of those same credit unions that are already creatively looking at new ways to extend credit during this tough time, when you just had 3.3 million Americans file for jobless benefits. So credit unions are stepping up. We kind of think of ourselves as the financial first responders during challenges like this.
Mirza Baradaran joins this conversation as well. She's a professor at UC Irvine Law School, and she's an author of 2 books that focus on banking and inequality. And Mirza, the goal here is to not come through this crisis more unequal from a financial perspective and an economic perspective than we were going into it. And I think it's fair to say we went into this crisis in America more unequal than we've ever been before.
Absolutely. And usually when there's a crisis like this, it hits the people at the bottom who are the most vulnerable the hardest. There's this old adage, when Wall Street gets a cold, Harlem gets pneumonia, right? And I think you can see the case in this scenario as well. I mean, a lot of people who are salaried, who have vacation homes, who have the income and the wealth to be able to self-quarantine are going to do so. And there's a lot of people. I mean, this is 40 to 50% of the population who needs their wage for food and shelter. And these are the people who are going to be hit the worst and the hardest. Small businesses are their employers a lot of times, and those businesses are also going to be hit. And so I think, anytime you have a recession, a depression, people recover differently. I mean, you still have 80% of the population that hasn't recovered from the last recession, and this is going to hit them even harder than the last one.
Jim, one of the things go ahead.
Right now. So, no, I was going to say, just before the coronavirus struck, 8 out of 10 Americans were living paycheck to paycheck. I mean, they had a paycheck, they had a job. Right. Now they're not quite so sure they've got a job, and there's a lot of that uncertainty that's permeating the entire economy, clearly.
Yeah, and look, Mirza, one of the things that the certain governors are saying, and the federal government has said, is that a moratorium on evictions, on mortgage procedures, on penalties for people who do that. But there are a lot of big banks in this country who took a lot of money from taxpayers last time around, and they're all much more profitable than they were. Have we learned a lesson from 2008, 2009, that the trick here is to figure out how to keep all those people going that Jim's just talking about, right? How to keep people who were just under the line going so that they don't fall further, and we don't have a yet bigger problem with long-term unemployment, long-term homelessness, long-term working poor?
No, actually, I don't think we have a way of, we don't have the tools and the structure to actually do bottom-up support. What we have is Federal Reserve monetary policy and even fiscal stimulus. A lot of that is premised on banks being an intermediary and having the credit come down. And credit unions sometimes do that. Small banks can do that. But the bigger banks, a lot of times that those funds and the stimulus stays up in their balance sheets and doesn't ever trickle down, right? We know that trickle-down economics economics doesn't work, but I don't think trickle-down monetary policy works. And those are the buttons that we keep pushing. And it is not to say that we shouldn't help repo markets and commercial paper. Those are essential because you don't want those things to lock up. But even when you're talking about stimulus checks, that $1,200, how do you get that money to someone who's unbanked, who doesn't have a bank account in their, doesn't have a bank in their town, right? How do you get them an actual physical check that's going to come in 6 to 8 weeks? They have to go to a check casher and pay 10% of that check just to be able to use it. So I don't actually think we have a structure that even understands. Mm-hmm.
We actually do.
I promise I am going to spend the next week, I'm on at 3 o'clock every day, and I'm going to spend the next week explaining to people on the edges, people who are not banked, who didn't file a tax return in 2018, who didn't file a tax return in 2019, whose banking information is not up to date, whose address may not be up to date with the government, how you are going to get that check. Because if you do it right, you could get it within 3 weeks. But Jim, as you point out, 3 weeks plus the 2 weeks we've already been through is too long for some Americans. Thanks to both of you. We'll continue this discussion. Jim Nussle and Marissa Baradar. That does it for me tonight. Coverage picks up tomorrow morning, starting with Morning Joe First Look. Join me, as I said, every day, 3 p.m. Eastern, Monday to Friday on MSNBC. Have yourself a safe evening.